There's a shift happening in global politics that's easy to dismiss if you only follow headlines, but it has real consequences for markets. The renewed discussion around Greenland isn't a joke, and it's not just political theater. It reflects how seriously the United States is thinking about long-term security, influence, and control as the world changes. The Arctic is becoming more valuable every year. As ice melts, new shipping routes are opening, access to natural resources is expanding, and military positioning in the region is becoming more important. Greenland sits in a critical location within that system. From the U.S. perspective, allowing rivals like Russia or China to gain meaningful influence there would create long-term security risks that are hard to reverse. The argument coming from Washington is that securing influence now is less risky than being forced into a conflict later through alliances. Europe views this very differently. Greenland is connected to Denmark, and the European Union sees U.S. pressure as a dangerous precedent, especially coming from an ally. That's where trade tools enter the picture. The U.S. has shown it's willing to use tariffs as leverage to achieve strategic goals, not just economic ones. Europe is responding by preparing its own tariffs and restrictions, which turns a security issue into a trade conflict. To understand why this matters, it helps to be clear about what tariffs actually do. A tariff is a tax placed on imported goods. Importers pay it, but the cost doesn't stay in one place. It can raise prices for consumers, reduce profits for companies, or force exporters to lower prices to stay competitive. In practice, the impact is usually shared across the system. When tariffs are applied between economies as large as the US and the EU, the effects can be significant. Together, these regions account for roughly 40% of global economic output and an enormous share of global capital markets. Their economies are deeply interconnected. Europe exports high-value manufactured goods to the US, including cars, machinery, pharmaceuticals, luxury products, and aircraft. The US exports energy, technology, agricultural products, and critical services to Europe. Energy is one of the most sensitive pressure points. Since the war in Ukraine, Europe has tried to reduce its reliance on Russian energy, but that transition is incomplete. Rising trade tension with the US complicates access to alternative energy sources, particularly liquefied natural gas. That leaves Europe in a difficult position, with fewer straightforward options than many people realize. Services trade adds another layer. While goods get most of the attention, services like cloud computing, software, and digital infrastructure are dominated by U.S. companies and are essential to modern economies. This gives the U.S. structural leverage that doesn't always show up in traditional trade statistics. Because these economies are so intertwined, escalating trade tensions don't just affect exporters. They affect corporate balance sheets, investment portfolios, and even pension systems. All of this contributes to uncertainty in financial markets. We're already seeing signs of it in currency markets. The US dollar has weakened noticeably against the euro, which challenges the old assumption that global instability always strengthens the dollar. We may be entering a world where rising geopolitical risk doesn't automatically push capital into US assets. When trust between major economic powers starts to weaken, investors often look for neutral stores of value. That's why gold tends to gain attention in these environments. Not necessarily because of panic, but because gold doesn't depend on political agreements or institutional credibility. At the same time, sectors tied closely to global trade, like industrial manufacturing, automobiles, and luxury goods, tend to face more pressure. Cryptocurrencies occupy a more complex space. They can struggle during periods of risk aversion. But growing trade fragmentation, currency instability, and cross-border restrictions can also increase interest in alternatives outside traditional financial systems. How crypto behaves depends largely on how trust evolves in conventional markets. The broader takeaway here isn't about Greenland alone. It's about a pattern. Economic tools like tariffs are increasingly being used to pursue strategic and security objectives. Trade, Energy, currency policy, and geopolitics are becoming more tightly linked. That creates an environment where volatility is more common, narratives shift faster, and long-held assumptions become less reliable. Markets aren't necessarily breaking, they're adjusting to a changing global order. And understanding that shift helps you see volatility not as chaos, but as a signal that the rules of the game are evolving.